Our story that we've been following now for 10 weeks through the Gospel of Mark picks up in chapter 14. And today we move all the way through chapters 14 and 15 in the Gospel narrative. Today, the Passion story begins. 2 days before Passover and the festival of unleavened bread. Passover was a pilgrimage festival that was celebrated in Jerusalem, and it was also a festival with nationalistic overtones, celebrating the exodus of the Hebrew people from enslavement in Egypt. So imagine how this celebration takes place now in the first century under Roman occupation. During this festival, the Roman governor moved from the palace by the sea into the city of Jerusalem during the whole Passover festival, bringing with him an increased number of Roman soldiers. And those who were looking for a way to arrest and kill Jesus decided not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people. While Jesus was still outside of the city in Bethany, he was in the house of Simon the leper. Now, there are 5 Simons in the Gospel of Mark, and this one isn't any of the ones that we've met before. But here, the very fact that Jesus is dining in the home of a leper is another transgression of the purity conventions of his day. As Jesus sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very costly ointment of nard. And she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on Jesus' head. Now, I need to clarify at this point that in Mark's gospel, the woman isn't the hostess of the dinner as she is in the Gospel of John, nor is she called a sinner as she is in the Gospel of Luke. And this woman is never portrayed anywhere as a prostitute, as some have suggested throughout history. And she isn't identified with Mary Magdalene until about the 4th century. This is a nameless woman, and a woman obviously of some means. And the text says, some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and the money given to the poor." And they scolded her. Nard was imported from India, and it was usually diluted because it was so expensive and precious. But this was undiluted, pure nard, worth about a year's earnings. And the objections of those in the crowd in Simon's house were understandable and based on strong biblical objections to her action. There is no indication in Mark that they are insincere in their scolding of her, that this money should have gone to take care of the poor, as it is commanded in Torah, and not be wasted in this way. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you wish. But you do not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly, I tell you, whenever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." Now, a good service, Eugene Boring says, was a quasi-technical term in the 1st century within Judaism that's different from almsgiving to the poor. The good service could be done for anyone, rich or poor, living or dead, and it required personal engagement and concern of the one doing the good service for the one to whom the good service is done. And there's no indication that this woman knew about Jesus' passion predictions made earlier in the narrative. This is simply a spontaneous and extravagant act that is beyond the imaginations of anyone in the room that evening. And this story of a wealthy, nameless woman being lifted up as the one whose story the world will know, is situated just on the other side of last week's apocalyptic discourse, where a poor, nameless woman was lifted up as having given more than anyone else in the temple's treasury, so much that she gave her whole life. Boring helpfully sums up the theme that runs throughout Mark's gospel, saying, the gospel is not an abstraction, nor a summary statement such as God loves you or Christ died for you, nor even the grand narrative of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But the gospel is always bound up with the concrete stories of the little people, the nameless individuals through whose devotion the gospel becomes real. Then Mark introduces us to a contrasting figure whose name we haven't heard since chapter 3. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. When they heard it, they were greatly pleased and promised to give him money. So he began to look for an opportunity to betray Jesus. But then we don't return to this storyline for a bit, because now it's time for the preparation for the Passover. And his disciples asked Jesus, where do you want us to go and make the preparations for you to eat the Passover? Parallel to the way that he sent 2 disciples to procure the donkey's colt in order to ride into Jerusalem, he now sends 2 disciples into the city again to find a place for the meal. Given that the population of Jerusalem swells during the Passover, it was a pious duty of residents of the city to open their homes to those who were on the Passover pilgrimage. So Jesus said, go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him, and wherever he enters, say to the owner of the house, Teacher, the teacher asks, where is my guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Now he will show you a large room upstairs, furnished and ready. Make preparations for us there. So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. Throughout this narrative, you've seen Mark is highlighting the foreknowledge and the authority of Jesus. Nothing is happening to him that he hasn't prepared to face. And when it was evening, he came with the 12. And when they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. They began to be distressed and to say to one another, surely not I. He said to them, it is one of the 12, one who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that one not to have been born. Now we have known since chapter 3 that Judas is the betrayer, but no one else at the table yet knows this fact. It is a secret Mark lets the reader in on, but no one else. Now, one thing we lose hearing this passage from our 21st century American vantage point is the significance of this phrase, eating with. Boring says that eating with is a very serious language in the first century Judaism, indicating a very close relationship, almost comparable to sleeping with in modern culture. That the traitor is someone who eats with Jesus strongly emphasizes that the new community Jesus has called into being is undergoing an extremely serious crisis. And then we come to one of the most familiar scenes in the gospel. While they were eating, he took a loaf of bread, and after blessing it, he broke it, gave it to them, and said, take, this is my body. Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he gave it to them, and all of them drank from it. He said to them, this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Truly, I tell you, I will never again drink of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. Keep in mind that Mark's church, reading, hearing this narrative, already celebrates the Eucharist before they've even read or heard this passage. And interestingly, in Mark's rendering, there is no commandment to repeat this meal, nor any notion that the meal is in remembrance of Jesus. Likely, Mark has no concept of Jesus's enduring presence being a part of the Eucharistic celebration. That's a doctrine that develops later in the church's history. But then we are back to that auspicious location of divine revelation and eschatological significance, the Mount of Olives. Here again, a shocking revelation will take place for the disciples who go up the mount with Jesus. Jesus said to them, "You will all become deserters. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter said to him, "Even though all become deserters, I will not." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this day, this very night, before the cock crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. But Peter said vehemently, "Even though I must die with you, I will not deny you." And all of them said the same. They all said that they would never be the one to betray him. And Peter distinguishes himself from the other disciples as especially committed to Jesus, even to death. And even as Jesus knows this isn't true of any of them, especially Peter, notice that Jesus leaves open the possibility that they will yet continue to follow him after their abandonment and scattering in fear. They will be regathered by divine grace, and Jesus will go before them to Galilee, an instruction reiterated again at the empty tomb. Then a very emotional section of the story begins. In his hour of deep distress, Jesus seeks the companionship of his friends and disciples to remain with him and pray with him through the dark hours. They went to a place called Gethsemane, and he said to the disciples, "Sit here while I pray." He took with him Peter and James and John and began to be distressed and agitated. And he said to them, "I am deeply grieved, even to death. Remain here and keep awake." And going a little farther, he threw himself on the ground and prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, "Abba, Father, for you all things are possible. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I want, but what you want." In such sorrow that he thought that he would die from the emotional distress alone. Both cup and hour here reiterating eschatological themes that we've seen raised in the last chapter, symbols of final judgment. Jesus throws himself onto the ground, not a typical posture of prayer, but rather one of exhaustion and desperation. And yet the disciples can't remain with him. They fall asleep once, and Jesus wakes them and says, "Keep awake and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." A message for the disciples of Mark's day and of ours. Then they fall asleep again, and Jesus wakes them. Then they fall asleep a 3rd time, and Jesus says, "Enough! The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners." And with that, immediately, Judas arrives with a crowd carrying swords and clubs to betray Jesus with a prearranged sign of a kiss. Because in the dark, even Jesus looks just like everybody else in the crowd. And unlike the kind of lynch mob of angry townspeople that we've often thought of coming with Judas to take Jesus away, the weapons and the instructions and the prearranged sign all indicate that this was something more like an official, authorized police force come to arrest him. And at the end of the scene of arrest, the most heart-rending words appear. All of them deserted him and fled. And a strange detail, often overlooked but highly symbolic. A certain young man was following him, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, but he left the linen cloth and ran off naked. Now, I've mentioned before that clothes are often symbolic of the person in Mark. Combine that knowledge with the recollection that at the beginning of the gospel, the disciples left everything to follow Jesus. And here, at the end of the gospel, this young man leaves everything in order to desert him, to run away in the shame of nakedness. Next comes the trial before the high priest, with Peter following at a distance. Jesus is tried in the courtyard while Peter is sitting with the guards by the fire, and the trial takes place with a cadre of disagreeing testimonies. And at the end, the high priest asks him directly, "Are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One?" Now, this is a well-known confessional formula in Mark's day. And Jesus, for the first and only time in the gospel, reveals his messianic identity with the climactic words of the entire gospel narrative, "I am." They condemn him and strike him and mock him. All the while, Peter is in the courtyard, and a servant girl recognizes him as one of Jesus' followers, and he denies it. Then she involves bystanders. "This man is one of them," and he denies it. And after a while, another bystander is certain that Peter is one of them, and definitely a Galilean, and he denies it again with a curse and an oath. "I do not know this man you are talking about." And he breaks down and weeps. Boring says of this scene, Peter had wanted to be a low-profile disciple, but ends up solemnly before witnesses with a formal oath disavowing his association with Jesus. Next, another trial, paralleling the first one, but this time before Pilate, who asks, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus answers him, "You say so." The last words Jesus will speak until his cry from the cross. Mark then renders a story of a custom to release a prisoner during the festival of unleavened bread, a custom that we know of from nowhere else in ancient records except for the Gospels. And the people demand Barabbas be released, a rebel, an insurrectionist, and murderer. Interestingly, his name, Barabbas, is a common enough Jewish name, meaning son of the Father. Bar, son of, Abba, Father, which is likely Mark's ironic storytelling, juxtaposing one son of the Father with Jesus, Mark's true son of the Father. And Barabbas is released, and Jesus is flogged and handed over to be crucified. And from the Roman occupation of Palestine in 63 BCE all the way up to the Jewish revolt of 66 CE, the only people crucified in Palestine were those convicted of being revolutionaries and their followers. And the horrible and degrading form of death was reserved only for slaves and people of the provinces, never of a Roman citizen. And they lead him out to the courtyard of the governor's headquarters and mock him with a theatrical scene in which they dress Jesus up as a parody of a Roman ruler with a purple cloak and a crown-like wreath, only made of thorns. And Mark iterates the crucifixion without sensation or gory detail, with the simple sentence, "Then they led him out to crucify him." A passerby named Simon of Cyrene is compelled by the guard to carry his cross. Notice here the parallel to Jesus's instruction to his disciples just a few chapters prior to those who wish to follow him, taking up their cross. Then they come to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull. They offered him wine mixed with myrrh, and he doesn't drink it. And they crucify him while dividing his clothes among them. They taunt him on the cross as he dies, and not one voice on earth or in heaven speaks up on his behalf. Then Mark says, for 3 hours as he hung on the cross, darkness came over the whole land until Jesus finally cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? His only words on the cross in Mark. And as he dies, the darkness lifts from the land. A centurion, seeing him breathe his last breath, says, truly, this man was God's son, making the climactic Christological statement of the entire gospel, spoken by one of his executioners. Throughout the narrative, people have witnessed Jesus' miracles and heard his teachings and have failed to embrace him. The centurion saw no miracles, heard no teachings, only witnessed his dying, and becomes a model for Christians of future eras who will believe without having seen. Now there were women looking on from a distance, including Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph and Salome. They had followed him, the same words used of male disciples all the way back in chapter 1. They had followed him since his days in Galilee, along with many other women who had traveled with him to Jerusalem. There's a cadre of women surrounding Jesus from a distance looking on at the crucifixion. Boring says, the women are now introduced as the only hope that at least some of Jesus' followers will remain faithful to the end. Later, after he has died, Joseph of Arimathea, a respected member of the council who had condemned Jesus, went to Pilate at some risk to himself to ask for Jesus' body. Joseph had been waiting expectantly for the kingdom of God, the very message Jesus had preached throughout the Gospels. And we don't know if Joseph was one of those who voiced his condemnation of Jesus at the trial or not. That is left ambiguous. But now he comes to honor Jesus' body with a burial. And as the text ends this week, Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of Joseph, saw where the body was laid. Now, there's a lot of ambiguity in this Passion text. You may not have noticed all of this ambiguity previous times that you've heard this text in small snippets here and there. But notice all of the places it shows up. The uncertainty of Pilate. Darkness that is not interpreted, but that is obviously meaningful. The centurion, both executioner and paragon of faith. The abject failure of the disciples who desert him, alongside the portent of their return to discipleship, still on the horizon. The women who follow close, but still at a distance. Joseph, who may have condemned him, now coming to bury him. And the death of Jesus itself, central to Mark's understanding of the good news, but left unexplained. This is really intriguing. Boring says, for Mark, Jesus' death is salvific, yet Mark elaborates no theology of the atonement. Mark respects the ultimate mystery of God's saving act in the weakness and death of the truly human Jesus of Nazareth, and acknowledges the mystery of God's acting through the sinful acts of those who betray, condemn, and execute him. Mark affirms and narrates the mystery, but does not elaborate or explain it, does not incorporate it within some larger theological system. So, whether you come this morning believing in the moral influence theory of atonement, or the ransom theory of atonement, or the Christus Victor theory, or the narrative Christus Victor theory, or the satisfaction theory, or the substitutionary atonement theory, or the governmental theory, or the scapegoat theory, or if perhaps more likely, you're not entirely sure how to incorporate the passion narrative into a larger theological system, know you're in good company with Mark. So if you come to the passion story this morning, wondering what it all means, I invite you to embrace the mystery and ambiguity of something that matters in a profound sense, even if you're not entirely sure why.